Good morning and welcome to our UBC Learning Circle, Relation to Research, Traditional Knowledges in Academic Libraries with Xwi7xwa Library. Today's conversation is presented in partnership with the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health and the Xwi7xwa Library. We'd like to thank the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the UBC Learning Circle and allowing us to have these conversations today. Before we formally begin, I'd like to acknowledge with respect and gratitude that I'm joining you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Please feel free to introduce yourselves and the nation you're calling in from in the chat box. Today's conversation will be talking about the relation to research, traditional knowledges in academic libraries with Xwi7xwa libraries. I'll ask the panelists to introduce themselves in just a few moments. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Xwi7xwa. I'm the Learning Circle Manager, and I'll be your moderator for today's discussion. Joining us today, working behind the scenes, is Cynthia, our production coordinator. She'll be in the background interacting with everyone in the chat box. Finally, before we formally begin today's discussion, I will provide a gentle heads up that the topics covered may be sensitive or emotionally triggering. So please make sure that you are looking after yourself, and if at any point you feel that you need to talk to a friend, elder, counselor, or family member, don't hesitate to do so. We have some prompts in the chat for you if you need additional support. Now I'll turn it over to the panelists to introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kayla, and I'm here with my colleague Karleen, and we are from the Xwi7xwa Library at UBC, and Karleen is going to start us off with getting the presentation up. Oops, sorry, folks. Okay, there we go. So I just want to begin with our own territorial acknowledgement as well. I'm currently remotely tuning in with you folks from the shared territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh Nation in what is more known as, I guess, East Vancouver. Part of our work, especially when we're talking about relationality in terms of our professional work at Xwi7xwa Library, is the responsible stewardship and maintenance of Indigenous knowledges that are in written or recorded formats, and also the responsible accessibility that we provide to our patrons as well. So we'll be talking a bit more about some of these examples. Kayla, did you want to add in anything from where you are? And I am joining from the unceded ancestral territory of the Musqueam Nation, and I'm here at UBC campus on Point Grey. So that's where I'm joining from. So on today's agenda, Kayla is going to do an introduction to Indigenous knowledges and what they are, as well as Indigenous research and what it is. Then she's going to hand it over to me, and I'm going to go over finding some materials at Xwi7xwa Library that are related to traditional knowledges, with just a few examples on how to search our catalog. We're going to talk about Indigenous naming, and then I'll hand it back to Kayla to go over Indigenous data sovereignty and research protocols. So just a bit about us. My name is Karleen Deloria-Lyle. I am the Information Services Librarian at Xwi7xwa Library. I'm Ojibwe, Cree, mixed settler ancestry, and a member of Barons River First Nation. I was born on the ancestral traditional territory of the Okanagan people, and I was living there until about 5 or 6 years ago, and then I moved to the shared territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples so that I could pursue my degree and work at Xwi7xwa Library. And I'll hand it over to Kayla.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kayla Larson. I'm originally from Treaty 6 territory in Xwi7xwa area, so the Beaver Hills House area, which is also known as Edmonton. My mom is Métis and my dad is Ukrainian settler. I have only been in Vancouver for about 2 years now, and I am the Indigenous Programs and Services librarian for the Xwi7xwa Library, as well as the program manager librarian for the Indigitization program here at UBC, which helps Indigenous communities in British Columbia to digitize their oral histories and knowledges, as well as I am 1/3 of the Book Women podcast, which is a podcast focused on Indigenous storytelling and libraries. All right, so to start off, I think it's always important to kind of have a basis of kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about Indigenous knowledges, especially within kind of this academic context, or how Indigenous knowledges are defined within an academic context. So this can be a little bit different than a community context, but in general, when we're talking about Indigenous knowledges, they have at least 5 characteristics. They're personal, they're orally transmitted with exceptions, as well as Indigenous knowledges are really experiential. So for example, when we are out on the land, if we're having that experience with the land, you cannot actually have that full experience without being there. So your senses are not evoked unless you're out on the land. You don't know the sounds that are around you. You can't feel the land beneath your feet. You can't smell the smells. So that's what we say when it's experiential. We can read about it, but you can't actually experience it without being there. Additionally, Indigenous knowledges are holistic, so they bring together inner and outer worlds, the physical and the spiritual, and often they can be narrative, so they can present moral choices and self-reflection through different metaphors. Additionally, when we're looking at Indigenous knowledges, there's in general 3 types of knowledges. So there's traditional knowledges, which are living chronicles and origins, trajectories, and achievements of Indigenous peoples. Empirical knowledges, which are careful observations and relationships to human and non-humans. So this is ecological and accumulated over time. And then revealed knowledges. So revealed knowledges are sometimes revealed through things like dreams, intuition, and visions. So when it comes to knowledges in research, research really is a Western concept. When we go into our own communities as Indigenous folks, you know, what we are doing when we are engaging with our communities is not really in our own sense research as it is when you come to the university. It doesn't make sense. A lot of times for us, it's things like Kiyakwin, which is the concept of visiting. We are visiting with our folks. We are not necessarily there researching. So when we're talking about research, we need to kind of shift our thinking about what exactly research is when working with Indigenous communities, when working with our own communities, so that it makes a little bit more sense. So things like ontology, epistemology, and axology really do not make sense within an Indigenous context. So when we're thinking about going into communities, really the terminology that I like to think about is Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and Indigenous worldviews. So Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous knowledges, and then Indigenous axology, so Indigenous values as well. So instead of thinking of really like Western terminology, we can kind of shift our understanding of Indigenous centered research and knowing. And additionally, with kind of shifting our understanding, we can look at Indigenous research methodologies to help us. So here's a really great quote about Indigenous research methodology. So research by and for Indigenous peoples using techniques and methods drawn from tradition and knowledges of those people. So that's exactly what Indigenous research methodologies are. Indigenous research methods and methodologies they have really shifted from traditional methods that we've seen in academia. They often recognize the colonial past of Indigenous people, resist colonial narratives. There's a resurgence of Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and it really does break down the insider-outsider research. So it is more community and collaborative. It prevents from extractive research and harmful research practices. allows for things like Indigenous self-determination, and combats the power dynamics within traditional research practices. And often in this, we see Indigenous-centered research being the outcome that comes out of using Indigenous research methods. So Indigenous-centered research is community-led, and this is really important. It's kind of that nothing about us, without us focus. It incorporates Indigenous worldviews. It's purposeful, personal, and based on relationships and relationality. And so what relationality is the concept that we are all related. So it goes against the Western understanding of who is kin and who is not kin. It brings in those who are our relatives from the land, human, non-human relatives. It incorporates the land as a relative, as well as things like the water. And it looks at those who will be our relatives in the future and our ancestors. It also brings in things that are spiritual as being relatives as well. Indigenous-centered research pushes back against colonial boundaries and is focused on resiliency and resistance of Indigenous peoples. Additionally, one of the big things of Indigenous-centered research is that it really is there to raise up Indigenous voices and peoples as well. So usually what comes out of Indigenous-centered research and through the process of using Indigenous methodologies is data. So when we're thinking about data and research, which later goes on to books like we have in our library, or theses or recordings, data really is a very large blanketed term for many different things. When we're talking about data, we're thinking about things like data on Indigenous resources and environments. So this can be things like land history, geological information, water information and titles, as well as data about Indigenous demographics or social data. So this is our legal data, our health data, our education data. This can also be Indigenous-centered data. So this could be health data that's created by a community in partnership with another organization, or it could be data that's created by a larger organization that focuses on Indigenous communities. And then lastly, we have data from communities. So this can be things like traditional cultural data, archival information, oral literature, histories, ancestral knowledge, community stories. So data really is this large blanket of different forms of information. And often we collect many different forms of this at our library at Xwi7xwa. All right, so passing it over now to Karleen to see how to find this information that we so lovingly steward in our library and at UBC in general.
Thank you. So we will be handing our slides over to participants later, and this is really just a reminder in what I'm about to show you. We've just got a quick snapshot of the catalog that we're going to go over, and just a few example keyword searches that we're going to conduct in just a few moments. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just some of the more topical ways that we can surface traditional knowledges or Indigenous knowledges at Xwi7xwa Library specifically. Again, not an exhaustive list. And the other thing that we'll notice is it's not nation specific. So if anybody is interested in finding traditional knowledges that are nation specific or community specific, feel free to always get in touch with the branch and we can help you to surface those as well. So I'm just going to stop screen sharing the slides for a second so that I can bring us over to our catalog. So there are two ways that we're able to find Xwi7xwa specific information. If we're at library.ubc.ca, the easiest way to get to just Xwi7xwa's collection is under the Books and Media tab, and we'll notice here that it's actually changed to Library Catalog, whereas the General tab directs us to Summon. So if I click the More Search options, then I'm redirected to our basic search function here, and we can very easily filter by library location. So here we're just going to select Xwi7xwa Library, and this is where we can see the screen grab that's in the slides. The other way is by starting at xwi7xwa.library.ubc.ca, and you can see that you can just conduct a search here, and this will directly filter to Xwi7xwa's collection specifically. So you'll notice that on the slide, some of the examples that I was given or giving to folks would be traditional knowledge. And you'll notice that I've added phrase search here. And the reason that I'm doing this is I want to make sure that I'm not getting traditional on its own and knowledge on its own. I really want to make sure that I'm getting traditional knowledge together. And that's why we've put phrase marks around them. The other thing that you'll notice is I've added a question mark here. And that's because, as Kayla's already alluded to in some of her slides, is that we've got traditional knowledge, but we've also got traditional knowledges. Sometimes we'll say worldview or worldviews, just to recognize the plurality that we're focusing in on here as well. And in order not to homogenize all Indigenous knowledges, although there are similarities in a lot of our ways of understanding our worldviews, we're not obviously all exactly the same, right? Okay, so here we can see that we're getting use of traditional knowledge. And if we click into one of these, this is called an item record. So we're starting to see how we're able to find Xwi7xwa specific information around traditional knowledge. One of the things that I also like to do, and I have included this in some of the shared resources, is I have the Xwi7xwa classification scheme alongside my searches. And this is especially important, not only as we're searching online, but also given the fact that we are currently closed to the public. And so what this offers is a way to kind of imagine, although we're not able to be within the stacks, we can start to see by the call number, if we're under PB36, then by coupling it alongside the scheme, I'm able to scroll and see, sorry to make folks dizzy here, but if I go under the P, I can see that the reason why I'm hitting this call number is because it's under community resources. So I can start to get an idea of, whoops, what this resource is about, in addition to the subject headings here, so around culture, legal status. Whereas if I go back to the titles here, I can see result 3 for intellectual property. Again, under PA. Or result 3 that's under NB. And this is under natural resources. So we can start to see kind of where these items would live, right? One of the other examples that we had was oral. And again, I'm adding the truncation here, the question mark in order to truncate. And this allows me to get results like oral, orality. You can see that it's under the Y call number. So this is going to be around literature, right? You could also try knowledge keeper. We could even try something like elder, for example. And so these are kind of just the keywords, right, that we're able to get. Knowledge keepers, right? So rather than just getting knowledge keeper, by adding the truncation, I'm able to get the variations within these keyword searches as well. And that way it expands the scope of the results that are going to be returned to me within the catalog, right? Okay, so I'm just going to redirect us back to the slides. I just want to move us to Indigenous naming. So this is a quote that I've pulled from the article, Indigenization of Knowledge Organization at the Xwi7xwa Library. And this was authored by our current head librarian, Sarah DuPont, our past head, Anne Doyle, and librarian Kim Lawson, who's now working at the Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center. And essentially what they're trying to get us to recognize is that within the dominant classification systems, Library of Congress, what they tend to do is alphabetize our nations. And so the only reason why they're located, you'll have a resource on Tsimshian, for example, located next to nations that are actually quite far geographically speaking. So rather than having our relatives closer to us and our knowledge is closer to one another, again, we'll start to see that folks, regardless of what kind of anglicized nation name that we have now or our own languages, that will have similarities within our worldviews, our languages, all of our knowledges and some of our teachings, right? And so having us separated in this way, the authors are basically saying that it's a dynamic of dispersal of Indigenous groups through the library classification, and that it's reminiscent of the dispersal that we've seen with our children, our lands, our communities, and our government policies. And so basically what they're trying to get us to understand is that this is part of, again, the concept of ongoing colonization of our knowledges. And that's really different than how Xwi7xwa organizes and describes our information. And so the ability to find ourselves reflected on the shelf in ways that are representative of ourselves, and also the ability to access that information is quite powerful, actually. And that's really what the authors are arguing for within this article. So at Xwi7xwa Library, what we have is a BC variant of the Brian Deere classification scheme. And on the right-hand side, what we're seeing is a bookmark that we usually have within our physical space. And you can see when we look again at the left-hand side, you're seeing kind of the topical way that we'll have our subject headings, which is also reflected in some of the item records that we were looking at earlier. And what we're seeing again is that if we take a look at BJ, for example, we've got Coast Salish, and underneath it, we're going to have our communities and our nations that are geographically literally closer to one another, and again have similarities within our traditional knowledges as well. And so these will be located closer on the shelf rather than in other libraries that organize themselves differently, where you'll see us split amongst the shelves.
Great. Thank you so much, Karleen, on giving that overview of our naming protocols and how to find the information in our library. And I am going to take it over and talk about Indigenous data sovereignty and how kind of the concept of Indigenous data sovereignty and what that looks like, and how we can start working towards reciprocal workflows and working within community protocols when it comes to data and sharing of information. Okay, so Canadian copyright. I work closely with the Canadian Federation of Library Associations on Canadian copyright and traditional knowledges and how exactly they can be protected. Within Canada and every country, there is international law and international organizations such as WIPO, which is the World Intellectual Property Organization. However, every country has their own perception of copyright and laws that pertain to copyright. So in general, within Canada, we do have issues with how traditional knowledges are treated under Canadian copyright law. Often when we're looking at traditional knowledges, they don't qualify for protection within Canadian copyright because they're too old and therefore supposedly within the public domain. And so the public domain is 75 years after the life of the author. So often within Canadian copyright, the author of the material is is not often identifiable within traditional knowledge, and therefore there is no rights holder in the usual sense of the term. And additionally, when we are looking at copyright, traditional knowledges are often owned collectively by Indigenous groups for cultural claims and not by individuals or corporations for economic and monetary gains. Within kind of the context of academia, and often what we see when we are working with researchers or faculty members, often copyright issues come when things are published. Technically, information that is published within a monograph, so a book or a report, when it comes to copyright, the copyright is held by those who publish that material. So if you're working on your thesis and you're publishing your thesis, you own the copyright of the thesis. You own the copyright of the book that you published. So therefore, under Canadian copyright, it is assumed that you own the copyright, you own the knowledges within that book. This is often contested when working with Indigenous communities. As we know, Indigenous communities own their knowledges and are the rightful owners of their knowledges. Right now within Canadian copyright, community copyright and community ownership of knowledge is something that is being talked about often, but there is no necessary, there's not necessarily a good solution for this, other than, really having clear research agreements within your thesis, acknowledging communities, acknowledging community ownership of information. And I think we need to get more Indigenous copyright lawyers out there. But in the general sense, I always like to say that Canadian copyright legislation has allowed for the legalized theft of Indigenous knowledges within Canada and will continue to do this unless we make transformative changes. So what we can do as academics, faculty members, as community members, as data activists, is kind of work within a framework of Indigenous data sovereignty so that we can kind of address some of these issues of copyright on our own within the way that we are interacting with data, distributing data, and producing data. So what Indigenous data sovereignty is it's the understanding that Indigenous nations have the right to the ownership and governance of data about them, regardless of where it is held and who owns that information. So for us at the library, we are just stewards of this information. Communities own their own knowledges. We are just holding it until, it could be returned, or we work with communities to decide what we will do with this information. Indigenous knowledges have the right to, Indigenous nations have the right to govern data in a way that aligns with their own data protocols and laws. Additionally, Indigenous peoples have the right to access data that supports nation rebuilding, and this often includes access to government documents, both historic, contemporary, and archival. Often we see the issues of archival documents when it comes to information that's being held at institutions or within private archives. And these institutions are allowed to set the legislation on who gets access to what information based off of things like Freedom of Information and Privacy Acts. So often what we kind of notice is with oblate records, church records, government records, these can be really hard for our communities to access, especially the historic data. But so often with archival information, it can be hard for community members to access it, but it's important information to access as well. So when I'm talking about Indigenous data and Indigenous data protocols are based off of different things, and they are set by communities. They govern different forms of data than just traditional knowledges. So when we're talking about traditional knowledges within kind of a sense, there is no universally accepted definition of what a traditional knowledge or traditional knowledges are. But in general, we like to say that they are knowledges or traditional expressions or distinctive signs and symbols associated with traditional knowledges. They're resulting from intellectual activity in a traditional context and includes things like know-hows, practices, skills, and innovations. Additionally, what we have that often comes out of traditional knowledges are Indigenous cultural expressions. So Indigenous cultural expressions are similar to traditional knowledge in the sense that they can encompass the knowledge to create them. So these can be things like dances, regalia, designs, and songs. Often, Indigenous cultural expressions are easier to cover under Canadian copyright law because they are tangible items. So think of things like button blankets or signs or symbols that communities produce, pieces of art. And then lastly, kind of within these data protocols, another form of data that's governed under them is biocultural and genetic resources. So these can be things like microorganism, plant varieties, animal breeds, et cetera. So these are kind of the different forms of data that have protocols around them. When we're looking at these specific protocols, often they are informed by ownership and inheritance. So this can be at a community level, a clan level, or a family level. They're earned. So it takes a really long time to learn about kind of the protocols around these knowledges. So for example, in my own community, to learn about the drum, it can take many weeks, months, years to learn about drum teachings, or even if we're thinking about moon time teachings as well, it can take a long time to learn those knowledges behind it. Often Indigenous data protocols are also informed by age, gender identity, geography, seasons. Wintertime is usually a time for telling stories. Only certain stories are told around the winter, and then techniques. When we're looking at these protocols as well, they can use collective knowledges that can be informed by different communities, clans, or families, and they often follow Indigenous laws as well. So they can be informed by our own laws that we set within our communities. So for example, these sharing protocols within my community could be set by the concept of Wakotowin, which is kind of our kin relations and who you're related to, and Miowasitowin, which is the concept of having a good relation. We share stories within our own kin, and we share stories based off of respect as well. So when we're looking at how we can share data in a responsible way, there are a few organizations that can inform our own practices and help us along the way. One of the organizations that I really admire and like is GIDA, which is the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. So what GIDA has done is they have created the FAIR and CARE principles. So the concept of FAIR is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. You might have seen the FAIR principle before. FAIR is something that we often see in open access and open data protocols. What GIDA has done, because they're taking into kind of this understanding of Indigenous knowledges and where Indigenous knowledges fit into research. So what they've done is they've created CARE. So CARE stands for collective benefit, authority of control, responsibility, and ethics. So yes, we can be fair, but we also have to care when it comes to Indigenous data. I like to call it FAIR Plus. So we think about also the protocols around data sharing. One thing that also with GIDA, what they can help with is when we're thinking about agencies like the Tri-Council. So we have the health, science, and social sciences as well. So the Canadian Tri-Council, what they want is for, especially within academia, for us to be publishing more openly, but that doesn't necessarily work as we've been talking about. So we can kind of advocate for FAIR and CARE within the Tri-Council, and the Tri-Council has been doing a lot of work on changing their policies when it comes to Indigenous research and how it's shared openly. And then next we have OCAP. So GIDA is more internationally focused. It's an international team that put together GIDA, whereas OCAP is more localized. OCAP is the First Nations principles of OCAP. So it is for when working with First Nations data, not Métis or Inuit. So if we're working with First Nations data, or we are from a First Nations community, it's good to work with OCAP. What OCAP stands for is ownership, control, access, and possession of information. So it's kind of like GIDA. And it acts as a tool to allow for Indigenous or for First Nations communities to remain sovereign over their own information and over their own knowledges and how it gets shared. OCAP additionally is a training program. So you can take OCAP through FNIGC, which is the First Nations Information Governance Connect, which are the ones that created the principles of OCAP. You can take the course through them and become certified in OCAP. Myself and the rest of the Xwi7xwa team has taken the OCAP training to inform our own practices while we're working and stewarding Indigenous data within the branch. And one thing that I just wanted to end off with before talking about the additional resources, and Karleen will walk us through some of them, is thinking more about how we can go about creating a reciprocal curation workflow when it comes to working with Indigenous data. So we all have workflows when working with data. The one thing that we need to think about is where communities sit in this and where we need to either make information accessible or put it into dark storage or have it private for communities. So we need to think about how we are facilitating conversations with communities about the life flow of data, who owns it, where it should be stored, and kind of how it should go around in the circle. And I will pass it off to Karleen now.
Okay, so the first resource that I wanted to share with folks is the Critical Indigenous Research Toolkit. This was created by Kayla Larson originally, who was working with some of the pharmacy students. And what we've basically done is just gone through and removed anything that was specifically about pharmaceuticals in order for folks to be able to have some evaluation questions. These start on page 6. And they follow several themes. So validation and verification. Essentially, these are questions that folks can ask themselves in relation to the resource that they're assessing to figure out if this is something that they'd like to use within their research. And go through and ask ourselves questions surrounding evidence, as well as cultural respect and competency. Right, so questions like, are there cultural differences of Indigenous groups acknowledged, right? Or even things around terminology and writing, concepts of ethics and consent, right? The other resource is called Locating Ourselves Geographically and Socially. And this really came out of a need that we noticed at the very beginning of the pandemic, especially. So many folks were used to, I think, being on either the Vancouver or the Okanagan campuses. And so when it came to territorial acknowledgements, people were pretty familiar and comfortable with those campuses and those spaces as well. But essentially, once everyone was working remotely, not only were there questions about how do people find out whose traditional territory they're on, but also in terms of land acknowledgements in relation to the research that we're producing and participating in academic education institutions. Right? Like, what does this actually mean? What does it mean to have a territorial acknowledgement and to really acknowledge again that kind of relationship between researcher and responsibilities that we have to our host nations? How does this impact the research that we're participating in as well? So we ended up taking a lot of the resources that we had either in the branch or from our folks from Indigenous initiatives at the Center in Teaching Learning Technology, and really making sure that these were presented in a way that people can go through and again, ask themselves these important questions and think about how they're going to participate in some of their research as well. We've just linked to the Xwi7xwa library research guides. And the research guides are exactly what they sound like. They are essentially just created to help guide people's research. And we've created them based off of topics that were commonly asked, topics or disciplines, right? So First Nations studies all the way down to Indigenous land-based activism or Indigenous new media. Some of the ones that I think will be particularly interesting for folks would be the Indigenous research methodologies as well. And similarly to what we were seeing in one of my previous slides, where I was giving some examples of phrase searches or keywords that we can use, you're typically going to also find some some hints, some helpful reminders as well in phrase searches. And I just want to acknowledge that there are going to be some outdated terminology or terms that we don't typically use in everyday language. And that largely depends on what type of information that we're looking for, especially historical, or if we're looking for anything around treaties, we're going to have to use words like Indian as well. And then we've also got some subject headings and call numbers. So these really do just serve as helpful reminders for folks. We've also left our contact information for folks because we ourselves are resources in addition to the resources that we produce. So people can feel free to get in touch with us with any questions that they have.
Thank you for that. It was really great. I loved learning about the different things like Indigenous data sovereignty, Indigenous knowledge in libraries, and it's a really great resource for having the territorial acknowledgements on your guys' website, because I know kind of just being across the nation, it's always a great tool to have that present. And yeah, so thank you to all our panelists. We just have some questions here. I'm just gonna hop to them. So the first question is, the online library looks like it's a great resource. Is it open to external folks who are not connected to UBC?
Yeah, so any library, any branch of UBC library as a whole is absolutely accessible for folks. Anyone is able to come in. There is the caveat of, there's going to be different borrower services though. So one of the things that UBC Library is going to do is have a very high priority toward faculty and students, just to make sure that the resources are being used for folks that are participating in their education, obviously. So there's going to be shorter loan periods. And there's also some things like when we do purchase, when we subscribe to e-resources, especially, folks will only be able to access those if they're actually on campus, but everything in some way, shape, or form is accessible as long as folks are able to make it all the way out to UBC Library. And there is also for folks who self-identify as Indigenous, UBC Library has an Aboriginal borrower card, which waives any fees. So usually folks will have to pay a bit of money in order to access collections, whereas for students and faculty, we're able, that's kind of part of our tuition and things like that, right? So if you're an Indigenous person, though, that will be waived.
Great. We have another question here. It says, does Xwi7xwa have any protocols around publishing materials which could potentially be weaponized against Indigenous communities or absorbed by neoliberal practices? If we conduct research as affiliates of UBC, are there ways of ensuring that certain information is not made public or can be kept for Indigenous communities themselves? I know OTIP exists, but I'm curious more about how the library engages with this. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about this, and then Karleen can probably talk about the critical literacy kits and our collections development policy, which addresses a little bit of this as well. So one thing to note is that we, as Xwi7xwa, we don't publish. We don't do the publishing. We get the published information. But there are some things that we do when it comes to what materials actually we keep in the library and how we support researchers ourselves as librarians and as kind of experts in this field and with working with Indigenous content and being Indigenous ourselves. So luckily here at UBC, we do have IRSI, which is the Indigenous Research Support Initiative, and they are a unit here at UBC that can help with Indigenous research, both for communities and for researchers in facilitating better research relationships with one another, which does take into context how we share information and protocols around information sharing. Additionally, when we're looking at BREB, or the Research Ethics Unit here on campus, when we are filling out those research ethics kind of applications before we actually do our research, they ask a lot about Indigenous research and working with Indigenous folks and the protocols around working with Indigenous communities. This is a lot different than other institutions that I've worked with. They aren't as comprehensive when working with Indigenous communities. Additionally, within the new Indigenous Strategic Plan here at UBC, there is sections in the ISP that do address Indigenous research and research relationships. So looking at how we are incorporating things like OCAP, looking at how our units have a better understanding of how we work with communities, how we understand knowledge sharing and ownership of information. One thing that we're also doing with UBC libraries and with our research data management unit is working closely with them to think more about how we can facilitate research within our data repository. So thinking more about, here we use Dataverse, which is our scholars portal. And so that's where we actually hold research data that's being created at UBC. So thinking about how community data can be kept in dark storage or made more accessible to community members as well through Dataverse. And working with Portage, which is a research data management planning group and system that we hear at UBC for when we're applying for things like SHIRT grants or large governing grants, for having a really good data plan that will address from the early stages those really critical research relationships to even thinking about where the data will be stored. How will we use things like TK labels in the research? How will we work with communities to be signing traditional knowledge labels, those types of things. So there's many things that kind of flow from Xwi7xwa. We don't actually do the publishing. We more just do the facilitating and the support of research and working with community members and academics alike to kind of have a better understanding of where they fit into research and where their rights are within research as well. I'll pass it over to Karleen to talk a little bit about the work that she does with this.
Yeah, so we do face this, I guess, risk or this question that we consistently have to reflect on, especially at the reference desk or the research desk where people are asking for information, right? So these are definitely, I think, ethical questions that we ask ourselves regularly. And again, I think that that's part of like when we're talking about in terms of land acknowledgements, or even what that means to be a guest on someone else's territory. And I'll talk about kind of that responsibility. That's kind of exactly, I think, where your question's alluding to, is what are our responsibilities within information sharing as and accessibility as Indigenous information professionals. So there's, you know, as we're seeing even within Kayla's portion of the talk, where we've got like protection from Canadian law or even like US law, and how it doesn't necessarily serve our needs and responsibilities just as Indigenous folks in the way that we understand relationships and relationality. And so there isn't necessarily an incredibly easy answer for these, but the way that we've been able to capture this is in our collection development policy that we have been using over this past year. Is before we were thinking about what we acquire, what we need to weed from the collection, or what we're able to make accessible to folks, we embed that before we started thinking about those things. We really foundationally we're turning toward the longhouse teachings that were offered to us within these spaces. And so those are foundational pieces in terms of responsibility. That's the way that we're able to capture that, not only within what we acquire, but also how we facilitate that process of accessibility. Because of course, there are going to be mistakes that we'll make because we're holding so many, we're stewarding so many nation and community information. And so that's kind of a way that we're able to make sure that we're responding in a good way to that responsibility, really. I hope that answered the question, but the only thing that I could add into that is, yeah, I think through the process of interacting with patrons when we are trying to fulfill an information need, this is especially where it's important to think about self in relation, a researcher self in relation to their research, why that relationality is important. Not everybody's supposed to be doing the exact same research. What are the goals of people's research? And information gaps can sometimes be looking at researcher responsibility in some of the ways that Kayla's talking about around these are the ethical questions that people are going to have to go through when they're working with Indigenous communities, but also, is there anything that we can provide as part of Xwi7xwa's collection in order to provide more resources to really give people a comprehensive understanding of researcher responsibility in that process and generating information that we don't want to keep perpetuating any sort of like research harms that have historically happened.
Great, thank you for that. And then we have a couple more questions here. Could you expand on how you have approached data management for Indigenous knowledge, given the changes to the tri-agency RDM policy?
Yeah, so within Xwi7xwa, what we have mostly been doing is that kind of sitting down with faculty members and really having conversations about things like portage and how they can use portage and address Indigenous data concerns within portage even before they submit to the Tri-Council, and portage is supported by the Tri-Council. So we can sit with researchers and go through their data management plans to kind of flesh out where they might need to be a bit stronger when it comes to that kind of the protection and protocols around Indigenous sharing, as well as incorporating community voices into their data management plan and sharing it with communities before it goes to the Tri-Council. And then additionally, working with units like IRSI, the Indigenous Research Support Initiative, for how they can facilitate those conversations with the Tri-Council. Right now, we do have a larger research project. It's a Mellon grant with Xwi7xwa Library and the University of Washington, where we're looking at those data management practices and how we can change our Dataverse Scholars portal to facilitate community information in a more reciprocal way. Because right now, the way that Dataverse is set up, and Scholars portal specifically, is that it is for UBC research and for UBC researchers only to be accessing, not for community members. But if we're looking at kind of Indigenous knowledges as being owned, then community members should have access to that information. So really, we have to think about kind of tiered access systems, such as like Mercadoo, or a kind of a program like Mercadoo, or how we can program Dataverse to be like it, and having tiered access for community members, researchers, and really thinking about what should be open and what should not be open. So there's many things kind of going on at once, nothing concrete, other than the ISP also does talk about it. The Indigenous Strategic Plan and the new one that just came out, and I believe that's the anti-racism plan that they have, also does talk about Indigenous ownership of knowledges in academia as well.
Next question, does your library have information on family history? If so, how would you connect to it?
Are we speaking? I mean, yes, yeah. I immediately started thinking of a book that I came across, and it's on it's called like Okanagan Voices in it. I think it's called, oh, and excuse my pronunciation, I think it's called Xwi7xwa, Q''SAPI. And so within that, there's elder voices, knowledge keeper voices as well, and people will talk about their family histories as well. And so usually these will come in the form of, they're embedded within published texts that you'll commonly find at libraries. Kayla, have you come across anything? I know you've gone into the vertical files quite a bit.
Yeah, so for thinking about genealogies and kind of doing your family history or that kind of stuff, it's a yes and no question. So we are not trained genealogists. Usually the best place to actually access this information are things like provincial archives, also the Vancouver Public Library, and other public libraries often have a lot more genealogical information than we have. The yes part of this is that we can help communities and community members in looking through our stacks for community information. So we do have our B call numbers, which will focus on specific communities. So you might find genealogical information within there. And then additionally, within our vertical files, there might be some of that information as well. And another way that we can support this is through kind of walking folks through how to use websites like Library and Archives Canada, which has quite an extensive genealogical section on how to do searching for them. So how to look through things like script records, Indian agent records, as well as things like census, documentation, so things like that. So that's how we can support, although the public libraries usually have a lot more information when it comes to genealogy work and a lot more experience doing genealogical work.
Our next question is, do you have guidelines/resources for how we include the other than human world as knowledge keepers and relationally invested? You noted the importance of oral histories, and the other than human have their own languages and communication networks. Are there ways of engaging and supporting the visualization of their voices without writing it down as a chapter in a thesis, for example? Are there other ways of capturing this?
So yes, I don't know how you would capture it. One thing that I like to talk about, like when we're thinking about the land, like the mountains are, so for myself, I'm a trained librarian and not a trained archivist, but do a lot of work with archives. One thing that I like to think of is, you know, the land, our ancestors are knowledge keepers. They are knowledge holders. Mountains, and this is always an example I like to give, mountains in my community are living. They are our relatives. They are our ancestors. And so mountains have stories to tell. They have their own way of telling us those stories as well. So like a rock slide, a mudslide is a mountain telling a story. It's contributing to stories. So trying to capture them within research can be really hard because of the way that research is so colonial still and westernized. So trying to portray our ancestors and the land's voice within academic research can be really hard. I've seen people get creative with it. So folks singing within their theses, so having live theses components instead of writing it. So sharing their traditional songs with permission, beading, talking about beadwork and beading items for their theses as a way of kind of bringing in our own forms of talking about knowledges. So for myself, I like to think of the mountains are an archive. You know, we can go into a physical archive, but really mountains, the ocean is an archive in its own way. It has its own knowledges, its own way of storing, sharing stories, storing the information, sharing information with us. So it's more about, I think, breaking down that idea of what is alive and what is not alive in your thesis and really trying to connect with that. But it is hard. It is hard to bring in our worldviews in that sense when it comes to relationality and how we practice relationality, especially within academia, as it doesn't fit in. And it's taking a really long time for academic institutions to kind of incorporate our knowledges into that in a way that makes sense to us. So I would just push, you know, if you are writing your thesis now, work with your supervisor on a way to be creative and push back on kind of the Western understanding of how knowledge is shared or how we think about knowledge. And hopefully it ends up amazing. I know that didn't really answer your question, sorry, but I think that's a complicated one. So yeah, okay. Did great.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that too. I was immediately starting to think about like rocks or something, right? Like our grandparents. And so it's, again, I think there's the priority of like a written or recorded word, because that's just the nature of the library itself. However, I have had many interactions with folks at the research desk where I'll say, like I can help you find these resources through this entry point, but sometimes these things will live in a literal human, in a person and an elder, or again, sort of like what Kayla is alluding to. And I just really quickly wanted to share, there's this individual that I have crossed paths with so many times throughout my undergrad as well. And I remember following this fellow named Dion Kazis. And at the time during our undergrad, he was just kind of beginning his work and his research. And when I'd come across him a few times, I remember he was really trying to figure out how he was going to publish his thesis and close his degree in order to fulfill the requirements from UBC. And what he was able to do, again, by working with the folks at Circle, is you'll see here he's got UBC thesis and dissertation, and then here's the supplementary material, because it was important to him to have that orality in here. And this is how he was able to work, by fulfilling that, again, that requirement of the written, but also making sure that there's this captured as well. And he's done it through supplementary material that way. So it is possible. As Kayla's saying, we do have to get kind of creative with it.
So cool. Like, it's expanding the way we do research, and like people always talk about how Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous stuff is very traditional, but it's like we're very innovative with how we do our research, or just how we capture our oral history and whatnot. So it's really cool to hear about that.
Yeah, I think one thing too is like when we're thinking within academia, and I kind of alluded to like research ethics now and kind of research ethics processes. When we're looking at research ethics applications, often it focuses a lot when we're working with Indigenous peoples and working with communities. It doesn't necessarily focus on the ethics on working on the land. So we're not really thinking of how to be ethical when we're going onto someone else's community, onto someone else's land and digging it up, doing field work. That is not addressed necessarily within research ethics. And I think if we do want to support Indigenous communities and reconciliation within academia, we do need to change our research ethics process to say, hey, how are you going to work ethically when working with water? How are you going to work ethically when working on the land, when you're extracting from the land for your research? How will this change? And I think that is kind of the next step in Indigenous research, is thinking more relationally about the land in even the application to go out and do research.
Just shared in the space in the chat too is something called the Cedar Space or the Cedar Lab. And you'll often hear, I recently attended a talk from David Gardner and Daisy Rosenblum, and they're really interested again they see Indigenous data. They'll talk about that relationship to information and Indigenous data. And they're also producing, again, kind of like we're talking about getting creative with the way that we're able to express ourselves through technology, and even like our relationships with technology, right? I think we've seen in the past, there's like this interesting way that Indigenous folks become historicized, it's kind of seen in the past. And we're really seeing a lot of folks, especially through Indigenous new media or even Kayla podcasting, right, is that we're actually quite creative and innovative. And we always have been, and you're starting to see developments through Cedar Lab and Cedar Space, so that there's many ways that we're able to tell our stories without these colonial confines, as we've seen through Dion's thesis as well.
And then someone was wondering if the resources will be shared after the webinar, and they said they love the look of the Critical Indigenous Toolkit and would love to take a closer look at it. I think those are going to be shared after the webinar.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And do you have any ideas on how to balance the access to rich research with ownership of data and research by the communities themselves, which would be presumably decentralized?
So I think part of kind of working with communities, especially doing that community-led or any work within communities, is it really does, when we're starting with research, starting at the research agreement process and thinking about from the very early stages, what is allowed to be shared and what is not allowed to be shared, and then working with the community to ensure that that is continuously practiced throughout the research process. And that even when, you know, we're coming to the end stage of our research life cycle of the data, that the data is destroyed in a way that makes sense to the community or is retransferred to the community. And we have very clear protocols about that. When it comes to, so that would be more decentralized. When it comes to actually what UBC is saying about data and data practices, it's slowly changing with the implementation of the ISP, and we'll probably see some fairly transformative changes to research data practices at UBC within the next couple of years as the ISP is being rolled out more across like UBC and through different units. Including here with UBC Libraries and our Research Data Management Center as well. So I hope that answered your question a little bit or alluded to some changes that might be happening within UBC at least.
Yes, and then we'll have this one as like our last question. How do you withdraw/deselect works that have outdated Indigenous or offensive/racist perspectives? Do you keep a historical perspective? Add notes on the work/bibliographic record to acknowledge the improper information or perspective?
So far, what we've been able to create is critical Indigenous literacy kits, and these were developed just for children's picture books at this point. And that's how we've been able to kind of mediate access either through the graphics or the contents of children's books. And this was done in collaboration with Education Library and Okanagan Library. So just wanted to acknowledge our partnership in order to get this work going. It has not yet been adapted to the other parts of the collection. And again, just kind of through the iterations of this inherited collection and all of the phases and people that have come through the branch. But no, these have not been reflected into the catalog records yet. But this work is being done, and the hopes is to see this adapted into other parts of the collection as well. At this point, that work is largely done through either myself or through Kayla or Sarah through the mediation process of ourselves as librarians.
Yeah, and we're also informed a lot too by like our collections development policy, which Karleen created. And a lot of that looks at our responsibilities and relationships here. And so we sit down together and we review specific books, or we take specific collections and go through them. If it's a really tricky one, we sit there and we discuss it together based on our own understandings and worldviews through our kin connections and the places we've lived, and we discuss the books and then either withdraw it or do whatever with it.
Okay, thank you so much. It was great to learn about the different things that you guys have at Xwi7xwa Library and just all the great resources that you guys have. And thank you, Kayla and Karleen, for being an amazing panelist and having an awesome discussion today. And just before we end the webinar, we would love to bring your attention to our up and coming UBC Learning Circle webinars. We have Jordan's Principal Information Session with Raylene McCreth on May 19th. Feel free to check that one out. And then on May 24th, we have Leaving a Legacy and Uplifting Cultural Safety with Kathy Olmos and Sherry Mercier. And make sure to sign up for our UBC Learning Circle updates at www.learningcircle.ubc.ca. And thank you so much. I hope you guys have a great day.